Did you always want to know how to use the autopilot in a Cessna 172? Then this is the video for you. Let's jump into the cockpit and then let's get started. But first, let's roll the intro. So we're inside the cockpit. Let's zoom into the system where we need to have a look at. First of all, we see the GNS 530 and GNS 430. They're pre-programmed with a flight plan, which is good. And if we look a little bit closer, we can see that autopilot system, which contains a lot of buttons. The AP button to switch on the autopilot, the heading button to switch on the heading mode, the nav to switch on the navigation mode, the approach mode, the back course mode, the altitude mode, and then the vertical speed up and down modes, and the knobs to change the altitude, either with steps of 100 or 1000 feet. Right, so that's cool. I would say normally wouldn't need to do anything about this, but of course you can change this, right? So you can change this already to 5000 feet, and let's say that you don't need to do that when you're airborne. For the heading mode, there's something which you need to keep in mind, and that's you need to configure the heading. But how to do that? It's relatively easy. You can do it using this heading bug. But I'm going to hide the yoke. So currently, if we would enable it, it will fly in north direction. But it's of course not what we want, right? Because we want to, let's say, maybe fly into, let's say, the direction of the runway. For example, want to do a straight out. Then you can do this. You set it like this. If you would activate the autopilot as well as the heading mode, then the aircraft will start flying straight ahead. So that's really cool, right? So let's take off, and then we can use the autopilot in, let's say, its full potential. So I'm going to increase the speed, and then we're going to try to switch on the autopilot. So a few things to keep in mind, right? The autopilot is normally not activated directly after you take off. In most cases, based on what I understood, between 400 and 1000 feet, that's where you switch it on. However, you can also decide to, switch it on at a later stage, right? It's really up to you what you want to do. So we're airborne already, right? Which is good. And then we're going to make, a left turn onto the route which we want to fly. So that's good. So I'm going to wait until the aircraft stabilizes a bit. And what you always need to do is make sure the heading mode is set, or the heading is set correctly, right? Because if I would activate it now, it would start turning back. And the reason for that is that we just set up the heading mode to that different, direction. So there are a few things which you can do. You can either, use the scroll wheel. If you're lucky and if you're on the mouse, you can use the scroll wheel and then move around that heading bar to the heading mode, which is now set, and then we're going to switch on the autopilot, right? Because we want to fly into this direction. So I'm going to press the AP button and then the heading button, which will now fly or turn the aircraft in that direction, which is, a little bit off track, right? So we need to adjust it a bit. So we're going to do that. And I will explain why you need to be staying close to that pink line, which you see over here, right? And the reason for that is, super important. Now, besides that, we of course want to make sure that we're climbing a certain altitude, right? Because we don't need to climb too fast, but also not too slow. As you can see, I already set up the altitude, right, when we were on the ground. And if I would press the alt mode, you will see that it will activate the altitude mode. If you press it again, you can configure the climb rate, which in this case 700 feet per minute. So let me decrease it using the button over here. And this is what they call the vertical speed mode. And you can see that the vertical speed meter changes. It changes now to 500, 400, and likely it will adjust itself pretty fast. And that's something which you need to keep an eye on, right? So if you're changing the values over here, which you can do, then keep an eye on the meters here, on the couches here, because they will change. Now, what you saw is that initially it was set to alt mode, but now it has been switched to VS mode, which stands for vertical speed mode. And that will ensure that my aircraft starts to, climb with a certain rate. But as you can see, you can also press down, right? So you can also use it to decrease the altitude. So if you want to descend, you can also use this mode very effectively. thing about the nav mode, right? Because the nav mode is also super nice, but there are some things which you need to be aware of. First of all, you need to make sure that the CDI source is set to GPS, right? You can see it over here on the 530 as well as on the 430. But if I press the CDI button, you can see that, let's say, this instrument changes, but also this changed to VLOG. So make sure that you're setting it to GPS, because else the nav mode might not work good or correctly. The other thing which you need to keep in mind is if you're switching the navigation source from GPS to VLOG, then what will happen is that will directly deactivate the navigation mode, right? So keep that in mind. So we're airborne, right? We're good. And we want to use, I would say, the GPS, right? We want to use the flight plan, because the flight plan, I would say, is far more useful than continuously changing the heading, because you need to continuously go to this heading bar and then change the direction. So let's press it, and then you will see that it switches to nav, which means we're close enough to the pink line, and you can see the aircraft starts turning, and then it will say simply use the GPS information for flying into a certain direction. Now, in some cases, what will happen is that the nav mode will be shown here, and then arm will be shown, right? That's if you're too far from the pink line, then it doesn't activate it, but it will arm it. Once you're close enough to the pink line, it will switch automatically from heading mode to navigation mode. So keep that in mind. If you're seeing that, nothing weird, but make sure that you're closer to the route which you planned, because it will not work. So we're airborne, right? And as you can see, right, we're going good, right? So it's nice weather, right, in the, let's say, in Key West. So we're flying into the correct direction. And let's see if we can do some other things, right? Because, hey, we're flying pretty nice. And what are the other modes which we can use? Well, for the other modes to use, we need to be close to the airport. And that's where that, let's say, APR, which stands for approach mode, or the back course mode come into play. So the approach mode is to use the ILS system to make the automatic landing, or at least guide you with the landing, because you can still do the landing yourself. The reverse mode, or the back course mode, is when the, let's say, beacon is on the opposite side of the runway, right? And then it needs to, say, calculate differently how it will use or guide you down from the altitude which you are to the altitude where you need to be. And that's also an important point, which I'm gonna explain now. So if I press the FPL button, I will switch to the flight plan. And in the flight plan, I can see the approach ILS number 12 has been configured. Currently, we're on our way to Moody, and after that we will go to Buff TT. But this one is where the approach starts, the approach for ILS 12, which means the ILS for runway 12. Okay, but hey, what are the things which I need to keep in mind? Well, let me show you. So you can open the, say, nice EFB, right, the electronic flight bag, and then you can see I already programmed the flight. And if you're lucky, you can find the information, right? The information from the airport, but also the information from, for example, the, let's say, approach which I need to take, but also the other things which I need to keep in mind. And this is what's super important, because if you, I'd say, are not aware how to use this, then keep an eye on this, because else maybe the autopilot will not work as you expect it to work, right? So let's have a look at the map, which you can find over here, right? Because the clip charts are the charts which are, I would say, in this case, applicable to the to this flight. But while we're discussing, right, I also want to show you what happens now, because we're close to Moody. As you can see, we're in 2 seconds, and if you would keep an eye on the aircraft, you can see that the aircraft directly starts to turn, right, which is good. So the heading mode or the navigation mode works perfectly. So going back to this, right? So first of all, we want to understand that ILS number 12 approach, because that's the one which we want to use. So you can press this button, which will show you the ILS map, or the approach map, sorry. And the approach map tells you a few things. First of all, it shows you the altitude where you need to be on a specific waypoint. So in this case, I need to be at 1700 feet for this waypoint, right? Also at Cessna, need to be at that specific altitude. If you are far above it, let's say it will result in issues. And what it will result in, that won't be able to capture this, let's say, glide slope, right? So in this case, the decrease rate is 3 degrees, which is, I would say, I think it's the default degrees. And this will bring you down to that, I would say, runway, which is over here. And what we need to keep in mind is that we need to be at this specific altitude, because else it might not work. And might not work, it simply doesn't work, believe me. Try to see it, right? So also in some cases there's some more information, right? So in the case of, I would say, misapproach, there's some more information about that, but we're gonna dive into those maps in a future video far more in detail. So now we know that, right? We need to be at 1700 feet at Jarno, which is the first one. We need to ensure that, I would say, we already start descending from this one to this one, right? Because that's, I would say, super important. And as you can see, I would say we're coming closer and closer. So keep that in mind, that you make sure that you're decreasing also the altitude of your aircraft, because if you don't do that, you will miss it, and that would be, I would say, would be a little bit bad, right? So Jarno and Cessna, we need to be at 1700 feet. After that, I would say it will start doing its thing. So how to change that, right? Because we're coming pretty close. So let's see if we would look at the autopilot, how we can change that. Well, relatively easy, right? You can simply use these buttons over here, and then use these buttons over here. And then you don't need to worry, right, that the aircraft directly starts to act, right? Because, hey, it says currently we're at, let's say, the stable, right? Because we're at 1700 feet, so nothing to worry about. But hey, we want to, let's say, decrease our altitude, right? So keep that in mind. If you're changing this, nothing will happen unless you press the Alt button and then say down, right? This is where the aircraft will start descending. So as you can see, the vertical speed now changes. So there's a really thing which is really important, is keep an eye on the speed, because as we know, if you're decreasing, then also the speed of your aircraft increases, which could result in going, let's say, into this yellow mode, or maybe even over it. And then at one point you will break the aircraft, right? Which is not something which you want to do, of course. So here we're descending the aircraft, right? And this would say that's how the autopilot can be used to, let's say, follow a specific direction while using the heading mode, using the GPS information by using the navigation mode, and also use the aircraft or the autopilot to climb or descend your altitude by using the Alt mode. And when pressing it again, you can use the vertical speed mode, which can be controlled using these buttons over here. So once you're there, right, you're pretty good to go. And it's simply, let's say, waiting until you completed, or you are, let's say, arrived at that specific waypoint. As you can see, in this case, it's a little bit weird, I would say, flight plan, right? Because it goes from one standard instrumental departure directly to an approach. So keep it in mind that it might not work if you use this flight plan. But if you plan your flight correctly, like I didn't do in this case, then it will work 100%. So what I will do now is I will switch to that Jarno, I would say, a navigation beacon, right? I'm currently descending to 1700 feet, which could say we're almost at 4000 now. So we will continue to do that. And then once at Jarno, we will say proceed with this video, and I will discuss how to use this nice option, which is called the approach mode selector. So as you can see, we're coming pretty close to Jarno, and that's really something which is really important, because that's where we need to do something, right? Or at least we want to do something at Cessna, but I would say, as you can see, I switched to the heading mode in this case. And the reason to do that is because if I didn't do that, it would, say, result in some weird things, especially with, as you can see, also the CDI is now moved to VLOC, right? So in those scenarios, what you can do is you can always switch back to the heading mode, because then you can still control the aircraft. I'd say, and using the autopilot, I should say, of course, and then make sure that you're flying into the, I would say, correct direction. Of course, you want to do the flight yourself, I know, but this is, I would say, how you could do it, right? I'm not saying that you must do it like this, but there's an option to use the autopilot in your benefit. So as you can see, we're approaching Cessna pretty heavily. We also have low fuel, right? So which is, I would say, something which we need to keep in mind, of course. And as you can see, we're flying into the heading mode, which is correct. We're flying onto an altitude of 1700 feet, which is also the case. We're not climbing or descending, we're just stabilizing on this one. And then I would say it's time to almost enable that, I would say, mode, which helps us descending, right? Keep in mind that you will need to have either ILS or AirNav, which is, I would say, kind of a similar system, but it works completely different. We will go into a future video about that, right? What the difference is. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we're going to activate that approach mode if we're coming closer to that Cessna beacon, which is, I would say, almost the case, right? We're just 3 nautical miles from it, but that's, I would say, not an issue, right? So let's see. So in the meantime, right, you can, I would say enjoy the nice scenery of Flight Simulator 2024. You can watch at the nice, I would say, buildings over there. Or you can keep an eye on your instruments, which is always wise to do, right? Always a recommended way to do. And as you can see, if you would say the wind comes in, the autopilot simply ensures that you're staying on onto that specific altitude, right? Which is so much easier than flying manually. But of course, you can still do that if you want. So we're 2 nautical miles from Cessna. So what I'm going to do now is show you the approach mode, right? So the approach mode is the mode which we're going to use. We can see Cessna also appearing here. So if we press the approach mode, you can see that it says approach. But the other thing it says is that it has GS arm. So this is the same thing as I mentioned when talking about the nav mode and the heading mode, right? If you're not close enough to the pink line and you activate nav mode, it will also go into that arm mode. And that arm mode simply means it's in the enabled mode. In the enabled mode, it's not active because it's, let's say, not receiving the correct signal. But I'm pretty sure that if we're coming very close to Cessna, at one point it will make sure that we're flying, or let's say we're capturing the glide slope and then we're descending. So let's see if that happens, right? So fingers crossed, but it doesn't, because it sometimes doesn't work. And in most cases, if it does work, it works perfectly. And now you can see it just switched to that glide slope, which makes sure that the aircraft will now start descending, right? So it will now start descending and fly the glide slope, say pretty close to the runway. You can see the poppy lights already there, right? So let's also decrease the speed a bit. And there's one important thing which I also need to tell you. If you decide to, say, kind of drop the flaps, then make sure that you're doing that, let's say, with caution, because if you do that, the aircraft needs to readjust, or at least the autopilot needs to readjust again. So you can see we're just gliding into the airport using the autopilot in combination with the glide slope which we configured here. So you can ignore the altitude, because what it will now do is will use the information available on these systems to make sure you're going correctly into the airport. So the engines are a little bit silent if you ask me, but that could be because, let's say, the engines are now either the fuel is completely empty or something else is happening, but it goes correct. So you can see that the landing goes pretty smooth, right? So you can even land without, touching the yoke, etc. yourself. However, that's one warning which I want to give you. I would say try to change yourself. And don't use the autopilot for landing unless it's really, there's the density is really bad, right? That also happens. If that's the case, then you can use, of course, the ILS system to, perform the landing for you, or at least you're going to have a look at it. So I'm going to decrease the speed a little bit further. Right, and that's something which you also need to keep in mind, that you're responsible for the speed of the aircraft yourself, as well as dropping the flaps yourself. So keep that in mind, that the autopilot simply will ignore everything, right? It will simply go down as fast as possible following that glide slope, because it's only looking at the altitude, also known as the lateral, if I'm correct. That's also, no, not the lateral, sorry, forget it. It only looks at the altitude and it doesn't look at the speed itself, right? So keep that in mind. So you're responsible for throttling or decreasing the throttle yourself. Keep an eye on those poppy lights, right? Because in some case you need to, do some corrective actions, because the autopilot is not 100% perfect in all cases. And I've seen scenarios where it simply, goes really crazy. And also keep an eye that you're not going too slow, of course. So I'm gonna drop the flaps now a little bit further, right? Because we're 1 nautical mile from the airport. And if you're increasing flaps, and also make sure that you're, let's say, increasing the speed a bit. Because else what the aircraft or what the autopilot will need to do is need to make a lot of corrections, right? And that's of course not what we want to do. As you can see, we're coming closer, right? Because I'd say we're going good. But we're a little bit, let's say, likely due to that flap change, we would say kind of messed it up a bit. So that's why I say be careful with those flap changes. So let's decrease the speed a bit. Because you can see that the aircraft itself right now will now start to do descent more heavily until, let's say, it is again on that good glide slope, right? Which you can see, by the way, over here, right? Didn't show it yet, but you can see it over here. And now the airport will be guided, pretty neat, I would say, on the runway. So, of course, also don't forget to ask the ATC for permission to land, which we didn't do in this case. So this is a complete autopilot landing, right? Without touching it. Now we'll take it over because I need to reduce the speed. But this is how you can use the autopilot in your benefit. Of course, I'd say, as mentioned already, I wouldn't use the autopilot for landing purposes unless the visibility is really bad. But hey, in this case, it was for demo purpose. So here ends also this video where we looked at the navigation system Here ends this video where we looked at the autopilot of Flight Simulator 2024, and then specifically for the Cessna 172 without the G1000 navigation system. I'm pretty sure that we didn't look at all the systems. For example, we didn't look at the VNAV, so keep an eye on my channel because I will likely post a new video about the VNAV functionality, which is, I would say, a little bit more advanced, but still can be really useful, especially when descending the altitude. Hope you liked it. If you're watching or if you're looking for more videos about Flight Simulator 2024, then have a look at my channel because there are far more videos about it. And also let me know if you like this video by leaving a comment or by using the thumbs up or thumbs down button. Thanks for watching and hope to see you back next time.